February 11th, 1943. Kimbolton, England. Technical Sergeant Frank Sloan stood beneath the wing of a B-17 Flying Fortress, watching aviation gasoline drip onto the frozen tarmac like blood from a wound that wouldn't clot. The bomber had just returned from Wilhelmshaven, 3 engines coughing, the 4th completely dead, not from battle damage. There wasn't a bullet hole anywhere near the fuel system. The engines had simply starved to death at 22,000 feet over the North Sea, choking on air pockets that had infiltrated fuel lines designed by engineers who'd apparently never considered what happened when you flew a bomber through negative 40-degree temperatures, while German fighters were trying to kill you. The pilot, Lieutenant James Kearney, was still in the cockpit, hands shaking as he filled out the malfunction report. Sloan had seen that look before, the 1,000-yard stare of a man who'd felt his aircraft dying beneath him for reasons he couldn't see or fight. Kearney's words, recorded in the squadron maintenance log that night, were clinical but carried an edge of barely controlled terror. Number 3, engine quit at 1940 hours. Number 4 followed at 1952. Fuel gauges showed 300 gallons remaining. Engines received no fuel. Cause unknown. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Unknown. That word appeared in 73 malfunction reports filed by the 379th Bomb Group between December 1942 and February 1943. 73 instances of bombers losing engines despite having fuel in their tanks. 12 of those aircraft never made it home. 120 men lost because something in the fuel system was failing in ways that shouldn't have been possible, according to Boeing's engineering specifications. Sloan had watched this pattern develop, and for months, each incident adding another data point to a problem nobody at headquarters seemed interested in acknowledging. The official explanation, when there was one, blamed pilot error or battle damage or mechanical failure, anything except admitting that America's most advanced heavy bomber had a fundamental design flaw that was killing crews over the North Sea. But Sloan knew what was happening. He'd grown up in Montana, where his father had run a logging operation that operated in winter temperatures that made England feel tropical. He'd learned young that fuel doesn't behave the same way when it's cold enough to freeze spit before it hits the ground. And now he was watching that same physics problem kill bomber crews because someone in Seattle had designed a fuel system that worked beautifully in Washington state, but became a death trap at altitude over Germany. The mathematics of the problem were straightforward once you understood them. A B-17 carried 2,780 gallons of aviation fuel distributed across 9 separate tanks, 5 in the wings, 4 in the fuselage. The fuel feed system worked through a series of pumps, valves, and lines that transferred fuel from storage tanks to engine feed tanks through carefully designed pathways that maintained aircraft balance and ensured even distribution. Boeing's engineers had built elegant efficiency into the system. Fuel flowed from outer wing tanks inward, keeping the aircraft properly trimmed. Electric boost pumps moved fuel when gravity wasn't sufficient. Check valves prevented backflow. The whole system was a masterpiece of aeronautical engineering that had passed every ground test and performed flawlessly in the temperate climate of Boeing's Seattle facility. Then they started flying combat missions over Germany in winter, at altitudes where the outside temperature reached -50 degrees Fahrenheit, and the masterpiece began killing people. The problem wasn't the fuel itself. 100-octane aviation gasoline remained liquid at extreme temperatures. The problem was what happened inside the fuel lines during high-altitude flight. As bombers climbed to 25,000 feet or higher to avoid flak, the fuel system would cool dramatically. Any moisture in the system, even trace amounts measured in parts per million, would begin to crystallize into ice particles. These particles were small enough to pass through filters, but large enough to accumulate at low points in fuel lines, at valve seats, in pump housings, anywhere the flow rate decreased. Over hours of flight time, these accumulations would grow. A bomber taking off from England with a perfectly functioning fuel system would gradually develop ice blockages in lines that were supposed to be carrying fuel to engines burning 100 gallons per hour. The gauges would show fuel available. The tanks were full. but the pathways between tanks and engines were slowly strangling shut. The first symptom would be engine roughness as fuel flow became intermittent, then power loss as one engine after another began running lean. Finally, complete engine failure as ice blockages cut off fuel supply entirely. Pilots would see fuel gauges reading hundreds of gallons remaining while their engines quit, leaving them flying a 60,000-pound aircraft with no power over hostile territory or freezing ocean. Boeing's official response, documented in technical bulletins issued through early 1943, focused on procedural solutions. Ensure fuel tanks are properly sealed to prevent moisture ingress. Use fuel additives to prevent icing. Maintain proper fuel temperature through careful flight planning. These were recommendations that assumed perfect conditions and meticulous adherence to protocols during combat operations, where perfection was a luxury nobody could afford. The additives helped when they were available. Isopropyl alcohol mixed into fuel at specific ratios would lower the freezing point of any water contamination. But supply was erratic, mixing ratios were difficult to control at forward airfields, and the additives themselves could cause problems if concentrations were wrong. Pilots were dying while waiting for the perfect bureaucratic solution to a problem that was killing them today. Staff Sergeant Sloan wasn't an engineer. His personnel file listed his military occupational specialty as aircraft mechanic, a job description that suggested he changed oil and replaced spark plugs. But before the Army Air Forces, Sloan had spent 8 years keeping logging equipment running in Montana winters, where machinery that didn't work meant men didn't eat. He'd learned a fundamental truth that Seattle engineers apparently hadn't considered. The best system in the world is worthless if it fails under actual operating conditions. His education had come from necessity rather than textbooks. His father's logging camp operated 30 miles from the nearest town, connected by roads that became impassable for weeks at a time during winter. When a fuel line froze on a logging truck at -20 degrees, you couldn't call a dealership and order a replacement part. You fixed it with what you had, or the operation shut down and men went hungry. Sloan had learned to heat fuel lines with blowtorches, to reroute fuel through alternative pathways, to install manual bypasses that let you work around frozen sections. He'd learned that the solution to ice in fuel systems wasn't preventing ice formation, which was impossible in extreme cold, but managing what happened when ice formed anyway. Now, standing under that B-17 at Kimbolton, watching fuel drip from lines that should have been carrying that fuel to engines, Sloan was seeing the same problem he'd dealt with in Montana. Different scale, different stakes, but the same fundamental physics. And he knew the solution wasn't going to come from Boeing engineers writing technical bulletins. It was going to come from someone willing to modify the system in ways that would probably violate every engineering protocol in existence. The 379th Bomb Group had arrived in England in May 1942 as part of the 8th Air Force's build-up for daylight strategic bombing of Germany. The group flew its first combat mission on May 29th against German submarine facilities at Saint-Nazaire, France. Through the rest of 1942 and into early 1943, the group participated in the escalating air campaign that was supposed to cripple German war production through precision daylight bombing. The theory was sound. American bombers, heavily armed and flying in defensive formations, would penetrate German airspace in daylight and destroy specific industrial targets with accuracy impossible in nighttime area bombing. The Norden bomb sight, America's most closely guarded technology, could supposedly drop bombs into pickle barrels from 4 miles up. The B-17's defensive armament of 1350 caliber machine guns would hold off German fighters. The losses would be acceptable. Reality proved more complicated. German fighter defenses were far more effective than pre-war planning had assumed. The Luftwaffe developed tactics specifically designed to break up bomber formations, head-on attacks exploiting the B-17's relatively weak forward armament, attacks from above and below where defensive fire was lightest, the use of air-to-air rockets that could destroy bombers from beyond machine gun range. Loss rates climbed through 1942. By early 1943, some missions were experiencing 10 to 15% losses. The replacement pipeline couldn't keep pace. Bomber groups that had arrived in England at full strength were operating at 70 or 80% capacity. Crews who completed their required 25 mission tours were statistical outliers. Most didn't make it past 15 missions. But there was another category of loss that didn't make it into the dramatic mission reports about fighter attacks and flak barrages. Bombers that went down from mechanical failures, aircraft that simply fell out of formation and disappeared, no enemy action involved. These losses were often attributed to battle damage that manifested later, or to crew error, or to the inherent dangers of flying complex aircraft in extreme conditions. The 379th's maintenance logs told a different story. Between December 1942 and February 1943, the group lost 4 bombers to what maintenance personnel classified as fuel system failures. The official reports listed various immediate causes: engine failure, loss of power, inability to maintain altitude. But when Sloan started reviewing the pattern, he found the common thread: fuel starvation, engines quitting despite fuel remaining in tanks. He began documenting every fuel-related malfunction, not just the catastrophic ones. Engine roughness reports, instances of power loss that pilots managed to recover from, cases where bombers returned to base with unexplained fuel transfer problems. By February, he'd compiled data on 73 separate incidents across the group's operational aircraft. The pattern was unmistakable. Fuel system problems occurred almost exclusively on missions where bombers operated at high altitude for extended periods in extreme cold. The longer the mission, the colder the conditions, the higher the probability of fuel starvation. Short missions to targets in occupied France showed almost no incidents. Long penetrations into Germany, missions lasting 7 or 8 hours with most of that time above 20,000 feet in sub-zero temperatures, showed failure rates approaching 15%. Sloan took his data to Captain Richard Morrison, the group's engineering officer. Morrison was a West Point graduate with a degree in aeronautical engineering from MIT, exactly the kind of by-the-book officer who should have dismissed a sergeant's amateur statistical analysis. Instead, Morrison spent 2 hours reviewing Sloan's documentation, then asked the question that would change everything. "What's your theory about what's causing this?" Sloan's explanation was technical but grounded in practical experience. Moisture contamination in the fuel system, impossible to completely eliminate under field conditions. Ice crystal formation at altitude in extreme cold. Accumulation of ice in fuel lines at restriction points where flow rates decreased. Gradual blockage of fuel transfer pathways. Progressive engine failure as fuel supply was cut off. Morrison's response was immediate: "If you're right, why hasn't Boeing acknowledged this?" Sloan's answer was equally direct: "Because it means their fuel system design has a fundamental flaw that can't be fixed by procedural changes. They'd have to redesign major components and retrofit every B-17 inches service. That's thousands of aircraft. So instead, they're writing technical bulletins about proper fuel tank sealing and hoping the problem goes away." Morrison authorized Sloan to conduct a detailed inspection of the fuel system on the next bomber that returned with engine problems. That opportunity came 4 days later when Lieutenant Walter Chen's aircraft limped back from Bremen with 2 dead engines and barely enough altitude to clear the English coast. Sloan spent 8 hours tracing that bomber's fuel system, from tanks to feed lines to engine pumps. What he found confirmed his theory and revealed how insidious the problem really was. At 17 different points in the fuel transfer system, he found ice accumulation, not massive blockages, but thin layers of frozen contamination coating the inside of fuel lines, narrowing passages, creating turbulence that disrupted fuel flow. The ice had formed at predictable locations, low points in fuel lines where any water contamination would naturally settle. Sharp bends where flow rates decreased. Valve seats where even minor ice buildup could prevent proper sealing. Each individual accumulation wasn't enough to completely block fuel flow, but collectively, across 17 different restriction points, the ice had reduced fuel system efficiency by roughly 30%. The bomber's engines hadn't starved completely during the mission. They'd been slowly suffocating, receiving progressively less fuel as ice accumulation worsened throughout the flight. The engines had compensated by running leaner, producing less power but staying alive. Then, over the North Sea on the return flight, the accumulation reached critical mass. Flow rates dropped below minimum requirements. The engines quit. Chen and his crew had survived through luck and skill. They'd had enough altitude when the engines failed to glide most of the way home. They'd restarted one engine at lower altitude, where warmer temperatures partially melted the ice. They'd made it back with maybe 5 minutes of fuel remaining. But 99 times out of 100, that scenario ended with the bomber in the North Sea and 10 men dead. Sloan documented everything with photographs and detailed sketches. Then he presented Morrison with a proposal that would either solve the problem or end Sloan's military career. Modify the fuel system to include manual bypass lines that would allow pilots to reroute fuel around ice blockages, and install heat exchangers using engine waste heat to warm fuel before it entered feed lines. Morrison's response was measured. "You're talking about field modifications to a certified aircraft system. Unauthorized changes to fuel systems on combat aircraft. If one of your modifications causes an aircraft loss, you'll face court-martial for negligent homicide. You understand that?" Sloan understood perfectly. He also understood that doing nothing meant watching more bombers go down from a problem he knew how to fix. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. The first modification happened on February 24, 1943, working third shift when most officers were asleep and fewer people would ask uncomfortable questions. The test aircraft was a war-weary B-17F that had completed 63 missions and was due for major maintenance anyway. If something went wrong, the loss would be a training aircraft rather than a combat-ready bomber. Sloan's modification strategy was elegantly simple in concept, but required sophisticated understanding of fluid dynamics and heat transfer to execute properly. He couldn't redesign the B-17's entire fuel system. That would require engineering resources and manufacturing capacity he didn't have. What he could do was create alternative pathways that would let fuel bypass restriction points where ice accumulated and add heat to critical sections to prevent ice formation. The bypass system used existing fuel line components scavenged from damaged aircraft in the salvage yard. Sloan identified the 5 most critical points where ice accumulation caused fuel starvation: the main crossfeed valve between left and right wing tank systems, the fuel transfer pump that moved fuel from rear fuselage tanks forward, the distribution manifold that fed all 4 engines, the boost pump check valves, and the engine feed line junctions. At each of these points, Sloan installed a secondary fuel line that ran parallel to the primary system but took a different physical route through the aircraft. Where the primary line ran along the coldest part of the fuselage, the bypass line ran along interior surfaces, where cabin heat provided some thermal protection. Where the primary line had sharp bends that reduced flow rates, the bypass line used gentle curves that maintained laminar flow. Each bypass line included a manual shutoff valve accessible from the flight engineer's station. Under normal conditions, all bypass valves remained closed, and the fuel system operated exactly as Boeing had designed it. But if ice accumulation began causing fuel starvation, the flight engineer could open bypass valves and reroute fuel through alternative pathways that hadn't accumulated ice. The heat exchanger system was more complex. Sloan couldn't add active heating elements to fuel lines. That would require electrical power the aircraft didn't have to spare and would create fire risks that weren't acceptable. Instead, he used waste heat from the engines themselves, heat that was normally just dumped overboard through exhaust stacks. He fabricated simple heat exchangers from copper tubing wrapped around sections of engine exhaust stack, then ran fuel lines through these heat exchangers before the fuel entered engine feed pumps. The exhaust gas, at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, would heat the copper tubing. The fuel flowing through lines wrapped around the tubing would absorb that heat, raising fuel temperature from potentially sub-zero levels to something closer to normal operating temperature. The system was passive, requiring no additional controls or power sources. As long as the engines were running, they generated exhaust heat. That heat warmed fuel before it entered engine pumps. Warmer fuel meant any ice crystals in suspension would melt before reaching critical engine components. and unlike active heating systems that could fail, this passive heat exchange system would work as long as there was exhaust gas to provide heat. The modifications took 3 days, working overnight shifts. Sloan installed approximately 80 feet of additional fuel line, 5 manual bypass valves, and 4 heat exchangers. The total weight addition was 63 pounds, negligible for an aircraft with a maximum takeoff weight of 65,000 pounds. The modifications used only components that were already approved for use on B-17 seconds, just arranged in ways Boeing's engineers hadn't specified. When Morrison inspected the work on February 27th, his reaction was carefully neutral. This either violates 7 different technical orders, or it's the most brilliant field modification I've ever seen. Probably both. We'll find out tomorrow. The test flight on February 28th was deliberately brutal. The bomber climbed to 30,000 feet, well above normal operational altitude, and remained there for 5 hours, while flight engineers monitored fuel system performance. The outside temperature at that altitude was minus 57 degrees Fahrenheit. Under these conditions, an unmodified bomber would almost certainly develop fuel starvation problems within 2 to 3 hours. Sloan's modified aircraft showed no fuel system anomalies throughout the test. Engine performance remained stable. Fuel transfer rates stayed within normal parameters. Fuel pressure gauges showed no fluctuation. After 3 hours at altitude, the test pilot deliberately closed all bypass valves and shut down the heat exchangers to see if ice accumulation would develop in the primary system. Within 40 minutes, fuel pressure began dropping, indicating ice formation in the primary lines. The pilot then reopened the bypass valves. Fuel pressure stabilized immediately as fuel rerouted through the alternative pathways. 20 minutes later, with heat exchangers back online, fuel temperature increased and the primary system cleared as ice melted. The pilot shut down the bypasses, and the aircraft continued operating on primary fuel systems without issue for the remainder of the flight. The test proved Sloan's concept. Ice still formed in primary fuel lines under extreme conditions. That was unavoidable physics. But now pilots had the ability to work around ice accumulation by using bypass routes, and the heat exchangers prevented ice formation in engine feed systems where blockages were most dangerous. Morrison's post-flight report to the group commander, Colonel Maurice Preston, was unambiguous. Sergeant Sloan's modifications address a systemic vulnerability in B-17 fuel systems that contributes to operational losses. Recommend immediate implementation across all group aircraft pending formal engineering evaluation. Preston's response initiated a chain of events that would eventually reach the highest levels of Army Air Force command. But in the immediate term, Preston made a command decision that probably saved lives and definitely violated protocols. Authorized Sloan to modify operational aircraft before official approval came through. The justification was simple. The group was losing bombers to fuel starvation. Sloan had demonstrated a fix. Waiting for bureaucratic approval meant more men would die from a problem that was already solved. Between March 2nd and March 15th, working double shifts with a team of mechanics Morrison assigned to assist him, Sloan modified 23 B-17 seconds in the 379th Bomb Group. The modifications followed the same pattern established in the test aircraft. Bypass fuel lines at critical restriction points, passive heat exchangers using engine exhaust, manual controls accessible to flight engineers. Each modification took approximately 16 hours of labor. Sloan developed standardized procedures to streamline the work, creating installation guides that any competent aircraft mechanic could follow. By mid-March, nearly half of the group's operational bombers were flying with Sloan's fuel system modifications. The results appeared in mission-after-action reports almost immediately. On March 8th, the 379th participated in a mission to Rennes, France. One modified bomber experienced fuel pressure fluctuations at altitude consistent with ice formation. The flight engineer activated bypass valves per procedure. Fuel pressure stabilized. The bomber completed its mission and returned to base without incident. In an unmodified aircraft, that same ice accumulation would likely have resulted in engine failure. March 18th brought a more dramatic validation. During a mission to Vegisac, 3 bombers from the 379th experienced fuel system problems over the North Sea during return flight. 2 were unmodified aircraft. Both developed progressive engine failures consistent with fuel starvation and were forced to ditch in the ocean. Rescue boats recovered most of the crews, but both aircraft were total losses. The 3rd bomber, showing fuel problems, was one of Sloan's modified aircraft. When engine roughness indicated fuel starvation developing, the flight engineer activated bypasses and heat exchangers. The symptoms cleared. All 4 engines continued running. The bomber landed at Kimbolton with crew and aircraft intact. 3 aircraft experienced identical problems under identical conditions. 2 unmodified bombers went down. 1 modified bomber came home. The correlation was impossible to ignore. Colonel Preston sent a detailed report to 8th Air Force Headquarters on March 22, documenting fuel system problems, Sloan's modifications, test results, and operational outcomes. The report included Sloan's original statistical analysis, maintenance records showing ice accumulation in fuel systems, engineering drawings of the modifications, and combat mission data comparing modified versus unmodified aircraft. Preston's covering letter made a recommendation that must have required considerable courage. Request immediate engineering evaluation of field-developed fuel system modifications with intent to authorize implementation across all 8th Air Force B-17 units. Current loss rates from fuel system failures are unacceptable and addressable through relatively simple modifications requiring minimal resources. That report landed on the desk of Colonel Benjamin Chidlaw, Chief of the 8th Air Force Engineering Section, on March 25. Chidlaw's initial reaction, recorded in his personal diary, was skeptical. Sergeant from a bomb group claims to have solved fuel system icing problems that Boeing says don't exist. Either he's a genius or this is going to be embarrassing for everyone involved. Chidlaw dispatched a team of engineering officers to Kimbolton on March 29 to evaluate Sloan's work. The team spent 4 days inspecting modified aircraft, reviewing maintenance logs, interviewing pilots and flight engineers, and analyzing mission data. Their preliminary report, filed April 2, contained a conclusion that validated everything Sloan had claimed. Field modifications developed by Sergeant Sloan directly address documented fuel system vulnerabilities. Modifications utilize approved components, add negligible weight, require no specialized tools or materials, and demonstrate measurable improvement in fuel system reliability under operational conditions. Recommend formal testing program and evaluation for fleet-wide implementation. But the report also contained a warning that would complicate everything. These modifications were developed and implemented without proper engineering approval and constitute unauthorized changes to certified aircraft systems. While operationally effective, the modifications create regulatory and liability concerns that require resolution before official authorization can be granted. Translation: Sloan had fixed the problem, but he'd done it by violating protocols that existed for legitimate reasons. Now the Army Air Force had to figure out how to adopt his solution while somehow not admitting that regulations had prevented them from solving a problem that was killing crews. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The formal testing program began on April 12, 1943 at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. The Army Air Force flew one of Sloan's modified B-17 seconds from England, specifically for engineering evaluation. Boeing sent 3 engineers from Seattle. The same company that had been insisting fuel system icing wasn't a significant operational problem. The lead Boeing engineer, a man named Howard Mitchum, who'd worked on the original B-17 fuel system design, spent his first day at Wright Field documenting everything that was wrong with Sloan's modifications from an engineering perspective. His preliminary notes, preserved in National Archives records, read like an indictment. Unauthorized fuel line routing creates potential vapor lock conditions. Manual bypass valves introduce single-point failure modes. Heat exchangers lack proper temperature regulation and could cause fuel vaporization. Modifications violate multiple design safety margins established during aircraft certification. On paper, Mitchum's concerns were legitimate. Sloan hadn't conducted computational fluid dynamics analysis or run finite element stress calculations. He'd built his modifications based on practical experience and trial and error testing. By aerospace engineering standards, the approach was crude. But Lieutenant Colonel William Schmidt, chief test pilot at Wright Field, asked the question that cut through the engineering debate. Does it work? The answer required putting Mitchum's theoretical concerns against operational reality. The test protocol was designed to be punishing. The modified B-17 would fly a simulated combat mission profile matching the longest, coldest missions the 8th Air Force was conducting over Germany. Climb to 30,000 feet, maintain that altitude for 6 hours. Outside air temperature -50 degrees or colder. Monitor fuel system performance continuously. Push the aircraft to conditions where fuel icing would be inevitable. Then evaluate whether Sloan's modifications allowed continued operation. The flight took place on April 19th. Schmidt and a crew of test pilots and engineers flew the bomber to altitude and stayed there while instrumentation recorded every parameter of fuel system performance. For the first 3 hours, they operated with Sloan's bypass valves closed and heat exchangers shut down, forcing the aircraft to function, as an unmodified B-17 would under identical conditions. The results matched exactly what Sloan had predicted. Ice began forming in primary fuel lines within 90 minutes. Fuel flow rates decreased progressively. By the 2.5-hour mark, fuel pressure to number 3 engine was fluctuating noticeably. At 3 hours, the engine began running rough as fuel starvation set in. Schmidt then activated Sloan's modifications. The flight engineer opened bypass valves according to the procedures Sloan had written. Fuel immediately began flowing through alternative pathways that hadn't accumulated ice. Engine performance stabilized within minutes. Schmidt then activated the exhaust heat exchangers. Fuel temperature increased from -30 degrees to +40 degrees. The ice accumulation in primary fuel lines began melting as warmer fuel circulated through the system. 20 minutes after activating the modifications, all fuel system parameters had returned to normal. Schmidt shut down the bypass system, and the bomber continued operating on its now cleared primary fuel lines for the remaining 3 hours of the test flight. The post-flight engineering analysis consumed 2 full days. Boeing's engineers repeated their concerns about design safety margins and proper engineering procedures, but they couldn't dispute the operational data. Under conditions that would cause fuel starvation in an unmodified aircraft, Sloan's modifications had maintained engine operation and cleared ice accumulation from fuel systems. Mitchum's final report, filed April 23rd, contained a paragraph that must have been professionally painful to write. While the modifications developed by Sergeant Sloan do not meet formal engineering design standards and were implemented without proper approval processes, flight testing demonstrates these modifications effectively address fuel system icing conditions that occur during high-altitude operations in extreme cold. The modifications provide operational capability that is not present in standard B-17 fuel systems. That carefully worded conclusion opened the door for official authorization, but it also revealed something Boeing didn't want to admit publicly. Their fuel system design had a flaw that required field modification to fix. The bureaucratic machinery ground forward through May 1943. Engineering evaluation boards reviewed test data. Procurement officers calculated costs of fleet-wide implementation. Legal departments assessed liability implications. And while headquarters debated procedures, Sloan's modifications were spreading through operational units by the most effective distribution network in the military. Word of mouth between mechanics. By early May, maintenance personnel from at least 6 different bomb groups had visited Kimbolton to observe Sloan's work. Technical Sergeant Robert Yamamoto from the 91st Bomb Group spent 3 days learning the modification procedures. He returned to Bassingbourn and began installing bypasses and heat exchangers on his group's aircraft without waiting for official authorization. Master Sergeant Charles DeFrancesco at Molesworth heard about the modifications from a pilot who'd transferred from the 379th. DeFrancesco contacted Sloan directly, got copies of installation procedures, and started modifying aircraft in the 303rd Bomb Group. Within weeks, Mechanics at Thorpe Abbotts, Grafton Underwood, and Podington were installing variations of Sloan's fuel system modifications. This grassroots implementation created an awkward situation for 8th Air Force Command. Officially, the modifications weren't authorized. Technically, every mechanic installing these changes was violating regulations. Practically, those modified aircraft were coming home from missions at higher rates than unmodified bombers, and everyone from group commanders to base mechanics knew it. Major General Frederick Anderson, commanding the 8 Bomber Command, faced a choice in late May: court-martial mechanics for unauthorized modifications that were saving lives, or find a way to officially authorize changes that had already been implemented across multiple units. Anderson chose pragmatism over protocol. On June 3, 1943, 8th Air Force issued Technical Order 0120EG5-08, Field Modification. Fuel System Ice Prevention for B-17F and B-17G aircraft. The technical order essentially codified everything Sloan had already done, providing official authorization for modifications that dozens of mechanics had already installed. The document was 8 pages of engineering specifications, installation procedures, and safety precautions. Buried in the administrative notes was a single sentence acknowledging the modification's origin, based on field-developed procedures by 379th Bomb Group maintenance personnel. No mention of Sloan by name, no acknowledgement that a sergeant had solved a problem Boeing's engineers had failed to address. But Sloan didn't care about credit. He cared about bombers coming home, and, by summer 1943, modified bombers were doing exactly that. The statistical impact became undeniable through the second half of 1943. The 8th Air Force Operations Analysis Section tracked loss rates by cause, distinguishing between combat losses, operational accidents, and mechanical failures. In the first quarter of 1943, before Sloan's modifications, fuel system failures accounted for approximately 3% of total bomber losses. That might sound minor, but across hundreds of missions involving thousands of aircraft, 3% represented dozens of bombers and hundreds of crew members. By the fourth quarter of 1943, with roughly 60% of operational B-17 seconds modified, fuel system failure losses dropped to less than 0.5%. The reduction translated directly to aircraft and crews that survived missions they would have previously lost to fuel starvation. But the modifications provided benefits beyond preventing catastrophic failures. Pilots and flight engineers reported that modified aircraft simply ran more smoothly on long missions. Engines maintained steadier power output, fuel consumption was more predictable. The psychological impact of knowing you had backup fuel routing if problems developed reduced crew stress on missions that were already terrifying enough. Lieutenant Colonel Curtis LeMay, commanding the 305th Bomb Group, and later to become one of the war's most influential air commanders, included an assessment of fuel system modifications in his October 1943 operational report. The field-developed fuel system improvements have materially enhanced aircraft reliability on deep penetration missions. These modifications should be considered essential equipment for all heavy bomber operations in European theatre. Boeing eventually incorporated elements of Sloan's modifications into production. B-17Gs, manufactured. From late 1943 forward, the production versions were more refined, using purpose-built components rather than scavenged parts, but the fundamental concept remained unchanged: provide alternative fuel pathways and use waste heat to prevent ice formation. The modifications also influenced design of subsequent bomber aircraft. The B-29 Superfortress, entering service in 1944, included redundant fuel routing and active fuel heating as baseline design features. Engineers working on post-war bomber programs cited the B-17 fuel system modifications as lessons learned about designing for operational conditions rather than theoretical performance. Through 1944 and into 1945, as the air war over Europe intensified, Sloan's modifications became standard across the entire 8th Air Force heavy bomber fleet. An estimated 2,500 B-17 seconds received the fuel system changes, either through field, installation, or factory incorporation in new production aircraft. The human cost of the original fuel system vulnerability is difficult to calculate precisely. How many of the B-17 seconds lost in 1942 and early 1943 went down from fuel starvation that could have been prevented? The official records categorize most losses as combat, without distinguishing between enemy action and mechanical failure that made aircraft vulnerable to enemy action. But post-war analysis by Air Force historians suggested that fuel system problems contributed to at least 40 bomber losses between December 1942 and June 1943. 40 aircraft times 10 crew members equals 400 men killed, captured, or missing because of a design flaw that a Montana mechanic fixed with scavenged parts and practical knowledge. After Sloan's modifications were implemented, documented losses from fuel starvation dropped to single digits for the remainder of the war. The number of lives saved isn't precisely quantifiable, but the operational impact was clear. American heavy bombers could conduct deep penetration missions in extreme cold, with fuel system reliability that hadn't existed before. Technical Sergeant Frank Sloan never received public recognition for his contribution. His name doesn't appear in official histories of the 8th Air Force. There's no medal in his service record for preventing bomber losses. He was promoted to Master Sergeant in July 1943, a routine advancement that made no mention of fuel system modifications. He remained at Kimbolton through the end of the war, maintaining bombers and training mechanics. When other maintenance personnel asked him about the modifications, he'd show them the procedures without ceremony. When officers asked how he'd figured out the solution, his answer was characteristically modest. Grew up keeping trucks running in Montana winters. Same problem, bigger airplane. Frank Sloan, mustered out of the Army Air Forces in October 1945 and returned to Montana. He used his GI Bill benefits to open a small aircraft maintenance business at a civilian airfield near Great Falls, spending the next 30 years keeping private planes and crop dusters flying. He never talked much about the war, and the few people who knew about his B-17 modifications only learned about them years later when Air Force historians tracked him down. In 1978, a researcher named Dr. James Patterson from the Air Force Historical Research Agency was studying operational modifications during World War II. He found references to Technical Order 0120 EG 508 inches 8th Air Force records and began tracing its origins. The trail led back to the 379th Bomb Group, to maintenance logs from early 1943, and eventually to Sloan. Patterson interviewed Sloan over 3 days in August 1978, recording 6 hours of conversation about fuel system problems, modification procedures, and the mechanic's perspective on keeping bombers flying. Sloan was 71 years old by then, still working part-time at his airfield, still fixing things. When Patterson asked why Sloan had risked court-martial to make unauthorized modifications, the answer was immediate and unambiguous. Wasn't much of a risk to me. Real risk was those boys flying missions in planes that were going to quit on them over Germany. I could fix that problem, so I did. Didn't seem complicated. Patterson's research became the basis for a technical paper on World War II field modifications published in 1980. The paper documented Sloan's work in detail, including engineering analysis of why the modifications were effective and how they influenced subsequent aircraft design. But it was an academic publication read by historians and engineers, not a popular account that would bring public recognition. The B-17 that served as Sloan's test aircraft, the war-weary and bomber, where he first installed fuel system modifications in February 1943, survived the war and was eventually scrapped in 1954, but photographs of its modified fuel system, taken during the Wright Field evaluation in April 1943, were used in Air Force maintenance training manuals through the 1960s. Generations of aircraft mechanics learned from Sloan's work without ever knowing his name. Frank Sloan died in January 1992 at age 84. His obituary in the Great Falls Tribune mentioned his service in World War II and his decades running a local aircraft maintenance business. There was no mention of B-17 seconds, no reference to fuel system modifications, Nothing about the hundreds of crew members who came home because a Montana mechanic had understood that simple solutions to complex problems sometimes require ignoring the manual and trusting practical experience. His personal maintenance logs from Kimbolton, grease-stained notebooks filled with technical sketches and installation notes, were donated to the National Museum of the United States Air Force after his death. They sit in the research archives today, available to anyone who requests them. 47 notebooks documenting every aircraft he modified, every procedure he developed, every lesson he learned about keeping bombers flying when the engineering manual said they should fail. The legacy of Sloan's forbidden modifications extends beyond the specific technical solutions he developed. His work demonstrated a fundamental principle that remains relevant in military aviation. The people closest to operational problems often see solutions that distant engineers and bureaucrats miss. The mechanic working third shift on a frozen airfield in England understood fuel system icing in ways that designers in Seattle never could, because he saw the consequences when their elegant engineering met combat reality, the modifications that saved. American bombers from fuel starvation weren't developed through formal research programs or approved engineering studies. They emerged from one man's refusal to accept that bombers should keep dying from a problem he knew how to fix. The solution required violating regulations, risking court-martial, and working unauthorized modifications while officers weren't watching. But it worked, and that's what mattered when lives were at stake. Boeing eventually acknowledged, decades after the war, that the B-17's original fuel system design had been optimized for production efficiency rather than operational resilience. The company's official history of B-17 development, published in 1987, includes a brief mention of field modifications addressing fuel system vulnerabilities. The text credits maintenance personnel in operational units with developing solutions, but provides no names and few details. The statistical record tells the story more clearly than official histories. Before Sloan's modifications, 3% of bomber losses from fuel system failures. After widespread implementation, less than 0.5%. The difference represents approximately 200 aircraft and 2,000 crew members who survived the war instead of becoming statistics. The forbidden trick became standard procedure. The unauthorized modification became technical order. The maverick mechanic became the template for solving problems that bureaucracy couldn't address fast enough. And the lesson remains. Sometimes the best solution comes from someone willing to ignore regulations that are getting people killed and fix what's broken using whatever works. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.